the story of the Noxian invasion that forced Ionia to become something it had never wanted to be, a nation at war. It follows the invasion from the conditions that made Ionia vulnerable, through the campaigns that created figures such as Irelia, Riven, Swain, Yasuo, Zed, and Master Yi, and into the uneasy peace that left both sides preparing for another conflict. Runeterra does not provide an exact calendar for every stage of the war. The surviving accounts come from regional histories, champion biographies, and stories told through people who experienced different fronts, which means several events can be placed in sequence without being assigned a reliable month or year. What the lore does make clear is the shape of the conflict. Noxus crossed the sea expecting another conquest, discovered a land that did not behave like an ordinary country, and spent years turning a collection of peaceful provinces into a collection of armed movements. Even after the Empire withdrew most of its forces, the invasion continued inside the people who had survived it. Alright, so before I start, let's promote you from a viewer into a subscriber. Your support means the world to me and nothing less. It would be much appreciated if you took a second to get that subscribe button. Alright, let's continue. Before Noxian ships appeared off its coast, Ionia was difficult to describe as a nation in the usual sense. It consisted of allied provinces scattered across a large archipelago called the First Lands. But those provinces did not answer to one king, one capital, or one permanent army. Communities followed local elders, monasteries, councils, spiritual traditions, and schools whose authority rarely extended far beyond their own lands. They shared a culture and a deep relationship with the living world around them, yet they had little reason to build the machinery required for a continental war. That arrangement had survived because Ionia's greatest protection was not a wall or a fleet. The land itself carried magic: forests, rivers, mountains, animals. And spirits existed within an old balance that Ionian communities tried to preserve rather than control. Buildings could grow as much as they were constructed, paths could change with the wishes of the environment, and careless interference with the natural order could produce consequences no outsider understood. To most Ionians, restraint was not weakness. It was the habit that allowed mortal life and the spirit realm to occupy the same country without constantly destroying one another. Centuries of living by that principle shaped the way Ionia understood violence. Martial schools certainly existed, and some of their students possessed abilities that ordinary soldiers could scarcely answer, but these traditions often treated combat as discipline, defense, or spiritual practice. Skill did not automatically produce an army. A master who had spent a lifetime learning when not to strike could not simply be placed in a uniform and ordered toward a distant province. Noxus had developed in almost the opposite direction. Its empire grew by absorbing other peoples, taking useful traditions into itself, and offering advancement to those who could prove their strength. That promise could be real for people who joined the empire, but it arrived beside armies prepared to break governments that refused. Noxus possessed organized war hosts, experienced commanders, siege equipment, ships, and a political culture that regarded expansion as both a right and a necessity. Under Emperor Boram Darkwill, expansion became increasingly costly and obsessive. Noxian forces fought across several borders, feeding an empire that demanded land, resources, soldiers, knowledge, and magical power. Ionia offered all of those things in some form. Its provinces were fertile, its spiritual practices were unfamiliar, and its magic appeared to be woven through the country itself. To an empire accustomed to taking strength wherever it found it, the First Lands looked like an extraordinary prize. Darkwill's Noxus could justify the campaign through its own idea of merit. The Empire claimed that weakness should never be protected merely because it had inherited land or authority, and conquest supposedly allowed the capable to rise regardless of where they were born. In practice, that belief placed the invader in control of the test. A community proved its worth by accepting Noxian rule or surviving the army sent to impose it. That logic concealed a basic difference between the two societies. Noxus treated strength as something that should be gathered, organized, and directed toward expansion. Ionia often treated power as something that became dangerous when removed from the place, discipline, or relationship that gave it meaning. A Noxian officer seeing an Ionian school might imagine recruiting its finest students. The students might believe their technique could not be separated from obligations to the land around them. Occupation brought those views into daily conflict. Noxian rule did not require every custom to disappear, because the empire often absorbed useful local practices. It did require final authority to belong to Noxus. Ionian communities could keep traditions only within limits established by outsiders, who might understand neither their spiritual purpose nor the consequences of disturbing them. For Noxian planners, the lack of a central Ionian state looked like an invitation. No emperor could call every province to arms. No national fleet guarded the entire coast, and no permanent command could immediately move forces toward the first landing. Conquerors accustomed to breaking capitals could occupy one center after another and expect local agreements to replace national surrender. The same decentralization later became a trap. Taking one province did not produce legal authority over the next, and defeating one group did not end the resistance of another. Noxus had to repeat its conquest across communities that knew their own land and did not depend on one institution for permission to continue fighting. The Empire found many doors into Ionia, and no single lock that controlled them all. The distance across the Guardian's Sea did not make conquest simple. Noxus needed ships, protected landing sites, supply lines, and commanders capable of operating in terrain they did not understand. Those problems encouraged a campaign built on scale and pressure. If one force failed, another could land elsewhere. If a province resisted, Noxus could punish it until neighboring communities decided that surrender was safer. The Empire did not need every Ionian to agree that Noxus should rule them. It needed them to remain divided long enough for resistance to become impossible. At first, that calculation appeared sound. Noxian troops began landing in the northern provinces, and warnings moved unevenly through a country with no central command. Some communities fled before the war reached them. Others assumed that local negotiation or the natural defenses of the land would contain the intruders. Monasteries tried to protect students and sacred sites, while provincial leaders struggled to decide how much violence they could use in defense of balance before that violence became another form of disorder. The northern landings disrupted lives before famous battles gave the war recognizable heroes. At the Galrin Monastery, the people caring for the young Sona learned that Noxian troops had begun arriving in nearby provinces. Their response was evacuation rather than a doomed defense. Sona eventually left Ionia for Demacia. One small example of how the invasion scattered people far beyond the places where soldiers fought. Displacement rarely appears on a battle map, yet it changed the first lands as surely as occupation. Monasteries moved students, families left coastal settlements, and people carried local traditions into provinces already struggling to shelter their own residents. Communities that had once relied on long relationships with a particular place now had to survive away from it, while abandoned homes became easier for the invaders to claim. Noxus needed those occupied spaces to keep the campaign alive. Every army across the sea required food, equipment, replacement troops, and protected ports. A landing force that pushed too quickly, inland risked becoming separated from the ships supporting it. Fortresses and coastal positions mattered because conquest could not continue on ambition alone. Phalar offered precisely the kind of position an invading empire valued. The Western Island held a fortress that had endured for centuries and guarded the approach toward the larger Ionian lands. Noxus eventually captured it, turning an Ionian stronghold into an imperial foothold. Even after the broad occupation ended, Phalar remained tied to Noxian plans and to the possibility of another campaign. The fortress also demonstrated how little the invaders understood about the country beneath their feet. Phalar had once been connected to the imprisonment of Syndra, whose power had been contained within a dreamlike state. The military value of the island was visible. Its spiritual history was not, and the war encouraged people on every side to use what they found before they understood it. As the first reports moved south and east, neutrality became harder to preserve. A province untouched by soldiers could still receive refugees or lose access to a route. A monastery far from the coast could discover that students had family inside occupied territory. Every Noxian success widened the number of people who could no longer treat the invasion as someone else's conflict. The Empire benefited from the delay. Soldiers could establish camps, study roads, identify local leaders, and learn which communities would negotiate. Those early gains mattered, because Ionia's eventual resistance did not emerge fully formed. It grew through failures, arguments, and separate acts of defense that only later became part of a shared story. The invasion widened before Ionia settled on an answer. Noxian warbands conquered settlements along the coast and pushed inland, each success proving that the first lands could be occupied. Local fighters resisted, but their efforts were separated by distance, custom, and competing ideas about what victory should mean. One village might ambush a patrol, while a nearby monastery refused to abandon neutrality. A provincial leader might seek peace as another called for retaliation. Noxus faced many dangerous opponents, but not yet a single Ionian war effort. Communication presented its own difficulty. Noxian commanders belonged to an established hierarchy and could pass orders through military channels, even when rivalry and politics complicated them. Ionian defenders often answered to people whose authority came from entirely different sources. A spiritual leader, village elder, martial teacher, and provincial council might all agree that Noxus should leave while disagreeing over who could command fighters or decide which land should be defended first. The war did not erase those questions by supplying an obvious national leader. Irelia would become a symbol at the Placidium. But her authority came after occupation had already inflicted years of damage. Karma carried spiritual legitimacy, not automatic command over every armed group. Zed possessed followers willing to act, though many Ionians feared the methods that gave his order power. This absence of clean authority made the resistance appear disorganized from the outside. Inside Ionia, it preserved the independence that people were fighting to protect. Asking every community to submit to one wartime command risked reproducing a smaller version of the control Noxus meant to impose. The practical need for unity collided with the cultural reason unity had never meant obedience to one center. Noxian pressure slowly settled the argument without resolving it. Communities did not need to agree on a permanent government to exchange warnings, shelter fighters, or recognize a shared enemy. Cooperation developed around necessity. It remained uneven, but it allowed separate acts of resistance to affect one another and made each imperial advance more difficult than the last. That hesitation did not come from ignorance alone. Many Ionian leaders believed the land possessed its own wisdom and that reckless action could harm the very balance they hoped to defend. The Kinko Order represented that duty in its strictest form. Its members protected equilibrium between the material and spirit realms, a responsibility that could require them to remain apart from mortal wars. When Noxian soldiers crossed the coast, the Kinku did not immediately become an Ionian army because their purpose was older and broader than the defense of any border. For Kusho, the Eye of Twilight, the correct path demanded distance from ordinary political anger. His son Shen accepted that burden even when it brought pain, believing that the Order could not abandon its role whenever mortals called for help. Kusho's adopted pupil Zed reached the opposite conclusion. Watching provinces fall while powerful warriors stood aside convinced him that neutrality had stopped serving balance and had begun serving the invader. Zed had already discovered forbidden shadow magic hidden within the Kinko temple. The power offered a direct answer to an enemy that respected force, and the invasion made restraint feel less like wisdom every day. He left the Order, gathered followers willing to fight, and created the Order of Shadow. What began as an argument over wartime duty became a permanent fracture in one of Ionia's oldest institutions. His break with the Kinko had roots older than the invasion. Zed had trained beside Shen under Kusho and proved himself through discipline. Yet the Order's pursuit of balance required him to accept limits, even when injustice stood directly before him. The long hunt for the murderer known as Jin had already exposed the emotional cost of that duty. Zed learned what it meant to face cruelty, while being told that his role demanded control rather than personal vengeance. Noxus turned that tension into a political choice. The invaders did not belong to a spiritual imbalance that could be observed from a distance. They occupied communities, destroyed homes, and forced Ionians to decide whether the Kinku's universal duty could justify refusing a national one. Zed concluded that an Order unwilling to defend its own people had misunderstood the balance it claimed to serve. Forbidden power supplied the ability his argument required. Shadow technique allowed his followers to fight in ways Noxian soldiers could not easily predict, while its very use declared that the old authorities no longer controlled which weapons Ionia could employ. Every success against an invader also strengthened Zed's claim against the Kinkyo. Shen saw the cost from another direction. The role of Eye of Twilight demanded choices that could appear heartless when viewed through one mortal lifetime. Spirits did not become harmless because Noxus had crossed the sea, and the boundary between realms did not pause for politics. If the Kenkyo abandoned its post entirely, Ionia might win territory while losing the balance that made the First Lands what they were. The disagreement could not be solved by proving that one danger existed and the other did not. Noxus was real, and spiritual disorder was real. The invasion forced two young men raised as brothers to rank those dangers differently, turning a philosophical difference into separate armed orders. Zed's followers eventually seized the resources they believed had been denied to the defense, while Shen inherited what remained of the Kinko. The Empire had not designed this division, but it benefited from it. Some of Ionia's most capable warriors spent the aftermath watching one another as closely as they watched the coast. That fracture revealed the pattern Noxus would leave across the First Lands. The Empire did not need to defeat every tradition in battle. By forcing each one to decide whether its ancient rules still applied, it could make Ionians break their own institutions from within. The Kinko survived, yet Shen inherited an order reduced in numbers and divided from people who had once trained beside him. Zed gained the fighters he believed Ionia required, but their weapons and methods carried a price that would continue long after Noxian banners disappeared from the mainland. The same pressure reached the spiritual leader known as Karma. Karma was not merely a political title. She carried the memories and power of an ancient soul that had passed through many lives, linking the present to generations of Ionian experience. The traditions surrounding her taught patience, peace, and trust in a wisdom larger than one lifetime. Those teachings had preserved Ionia through older dangers, but they did not give the young woman who bore the mantle an easy answer when foreign soldiers began taking the country apart. The voices of previous incarnations urged restraint. Everything around Karma pushed toward action. Communities expected the living symbol of Ionia to defend them, while monks feared that using overwhelming force would betray the principles the title existed to preserve. When she finally acted against a Noxian warship, she unleashed power great enough to destroy the vessel. The military result was clear, yet the spiritual consequences were not. Some of the ancient voices withdrew from her, and people who had looked to Karma for certainty instead witnessed the same conflict dividing the rest of the country. Her decision established a new principle for the war. Peace remained the goal, but peace could no longer mean refusing to resist. That change sounded simple when spoken after the fact. Living through it meant accepting that every act of defense might damage the land, a tradition, or the defender's own sense of identity. Karma did not leave the invasion as the unquestioned voice of an unchanged Ionia. She became the leader of a country trying to discover what harmony meant after harmony had failed to protect it. The person carrying that decision had once been a girl named Dara from the Northern Highlands. Visions connected her to the ancient soul of Karma, and monks recognized in her the next life of an office older than any current province. Training taught her to reach memories that did not belong to one body, allowing generations of experience to speak through a young person who still possessed her own judgment. That relationship had never been simple submission. Dara could hear the wisdom of earlier lives without disappearing inside them, and the invasion widened every difference between inherited teaching and present experience. Past Karmas had learned restraint through dangers belonging to their own ages. The current Karma faced ships, occupation, and an empire whose commanders could interpret patience as permission. Destroying the warships settled the immediate confrontation and deepened the internal one. People threatened by Noxus could celebrate a spiritual leader finally acting in their defense. Monks responsible for protecting the continuity of Karma could see the same event as a rupture with everything the office represented. The power had answered one question and created several more. The withdrawal of some past voices made the consequence personal. Karma's authority came partly from connection to those lives, and decisive action weakened that connection at the moment Ionia needed her most. She could either treat their silence as proof she had failed, or accept that the current incarnation had encountered a choice no predecessor could make for her. Her later leadership remained shaped by that decision. She defended peace because endless retaliation would consume the country. Yet she could no longer ask communities to trust that passivity would protect them. The position placed her between traditionalists who feared change and militants who treated restraint as betrayal. Karma's conflict mirrors Ionia's larger one, because both depend on continuity without remaining frozen. A nation that abandons every old principle to defeat Noxus may survive only by becoming closer to its enemy. A nation that repeats old answers after the world has changed may preserve its ideals in language while losing the people meant to live by them. At the Shojin monastery, the war forced a different kind of return. Lee Sin had once entered monastic life convinced that he possessed a special destiny, but pride led him to use power before he understood it. His actions harmed his instructor, and he left Ionia carrying the shame of that failure. Years of travel eventually brought him into contact with Udia, a Freljordian spirit walker who also struggled to control forces within himself. Their friendship taught both men that strength without discipline could destroy the person trying to wield it. News of the invasion drew them back toward Ionia. Noxian forces threatened the monastery, and the defenders could not hold indefinitely. Lee Sin faced the choice that appeared everywhere in the First Lands: preserve his restraint and watch a sacred community fall. or release a power that had already caused suffering once before. He called upon the dragon's spirit. The force drove back the attackers, but flames consumed the monastery, and Lee Sin lost his sight in the event. Victory and damage arrived together. The monastery's defenders survived the immediate attack, while the place they had tried to protect paid the cost. Lee Sin remained in Ionia afterward, no longer chasing the greatness he had imagined as a boy. His role became quieter and harder, because mastering the dragon meant accepting responsibility for its power every time he used it. The invasion gave him a chance to defend his homeland, yet it did not erase the lesson that even necessary force can escape the intentions of the person who releases it. Lee Sin's blindness became part of the discipline that followed. He could not rely on sight as he had before, and the power of the dragon remained within a body that had learned how quickly pride could misdirect it. The war did not grant him perfect control through one heroic decision. It gave him another beginning, built on permanent consequences. Udia's presence also connected the Ionian conflict to a wider spiritual world. He understood what it meant to hear forces others could not, and to fear being overwhelmed by them. Their friendship was not a military alliance between nations, but it gave Lee Sin the support of someone who recognized the struggle beneath his technique. The defense of Hirana showed why individual power could not replace every institution. Lee Sin could break an assault, yet the monastery still burned and required rebuilding. A champion might reverse one battle, but teachers, students, farmers, and local communities had to restore everything that made the place worth defending. This pattern repeated across Ionia. The law remembers extraordinary people because their decisions changed events, though survival depended on countless others moving supplies, sheltering refugees, carrying warnings, treating the injured, and rebuilding places whose names never reached Noxian records. Heroic power could create space for that work. It could not perform all of it. Far from Shojin, a young Noxian soldier was learning the same truth from the other side. Riven had grown up with little, and the Empire offered her a path based on effort rather than birth. She believed in the Noxian promise that anyone with strength could earn a place. Military service gave that belief a purpose, and her discipline carried her upward until she commanded a warband of her own. Riven's success brought recognition from the highest level of the Empire. A pale sorceress presented her with a runic blade, a weapon that represented the ideals she thought she served. It was large, powerful, and marked her as someone Noxus expected to accomplish great things. When her unit sailed for Ionia, Riven did not arrive as a reluctant conscript. She arrived believing that the Empire's strength could create a better order. The campaign steadily destroyed that belief. Ionia did not behave like the enemy described by simple imperial slogans, and victory demanded methods that treated Noxian troops as expendable alongside Ionian defenders. Riven's warband was sent into a confrontation where conventional fighting gave way to a chemical attack. The weapon did not distinguish cleanly between armies. Soldiers on both sides were caught in it, and the people Riven had led were abandoned by the command structure they trusted. Riven survived, but the Noxus she had believed in did not. Her sword now represented an oath the Empire itself had violated. Instead of returning to the army, she broke from the campaign and wandered through Ionia, carrying the weapon she no longer wanted and memories she could not set aside. Desertion removed her from Noxian command, though it could not remove her from the consequences of what the army had done. Her response placed her outside both societies. Noxus viewed duty through continued service, making survival followed by disappearance a betrayal of the unit and Empire. Ionians encountering her saw the uniform, weapon, and origin of an invader. Refusing Noxus did not automatically earn trust from the people Noxus had attacked. The runic blade made that isolation visible. It had once marked Riven as an ideal soldier and tied her advancement to Imperial approval. After the chemical attack, carrying it meant carrying the contradiction between the Noxus she believed she served and the command that sacrificed her warband. Breaking the sword could not become a simple rejection, because the weapon contained power of its own. Its fragments remained capable of revealing the past and harming people, which turned Riven's attempt to escape one symbol into the beginning of Yasuo's accusation. The object connecting her to Noxus continued shaping Ionian lives after she abandoned the army. Her years among farmers offered a different form of strength from the one the Empire rewarded. Work did not provide rank, spectacle, or a clean declaration that her debt had been paid. It required repetition and acceptance that rebuilding happens more slowly than destruction. The community sheltering her also had to decide whether justice meant exclusion, punishment, or responsibility carried over time. That choice belonged to people with reasons to distrust every Noxian survivor. Their willingness to judge Riven as an individual did not require them to excuse the invasion. The chemical attack connected Riven to several other lives across the war. The scientist responsible for supplying Noxus with such weapons was singed. A man whose work valued results above any boundary that might limit experimentation. Noxian commanders possessed the armies and the targets. Singed gave them a way to erase resistance without meeting every defender on equal terms. Once those weapons entered Ionia, the war changed from conquest into contamination. That distinction mattered in a land where the environment carried spiritual power. A battlefield could be abandoned, but damaged soil, poisoned air, and wounded ecosystems remained. Communities that understood the land as a living relationship experienced such attacks as more than military defeats. Noxus had not simply beaten defenders, it had injured the world those defenders were sworn to keep in balance. No account demonstrates that cost more clearly than the destruction of Wuju. The village and its martial tradition had initially avoided direct involvement, following a discipline that did not exist for conquest. Master Yi could not remain apart while Noxian warbands advanced through the provinces. He left to aid the resistance and used Wuju technique with a speed and effectiveness the invaders had not expected. Noxus recognized the threat. Rather than continue facing Wuju practitioners in ordinary combat, the Empire targeted their home with chemical weapons. Yi returned to find his people and his tradition almost entirely gone. The attack had removed a military problem, but it also created the last master of a discipline with every reason to turn his skill toward vengeance. Wuju technique had developed through a relationship with the spiritual power of Ionia. Its practitioners did not treat that connection as a tool for personal display, which is why the village's initial restraint belonged to the discipline rather than contradicting it. Yi's choice to enter the war already challenged the boundaries under which he had trained. His success confirmed every fear the Noxian command held about unfamiliar Ionian arts. A small number of practitioners could cause damage far beyond what conventional estimates predicted. The Empire answered by avoiding the terms of combat those practitioners understood and striking the community that sustained them. Targeting the village attacked knowledge as well as people. A martial tradition survives through teachers, students, routines, language, and the ordinary life surrounding instruction. Even if individual techniques remain, the culture joining them can disappear when its community is destroyed. Yi's survival placed that entire weight on one person. Vengeance promised a direct use for his skill and an enemy against whom anger could be spent. Preservation demanded patience, because rebuilding a tradition offers none of the immediate certainty of defeating the next patrol. Wukong eventually gave Yi a student capable of receiving more than isolated techniques. Teaching required the master to examine what Wuju meant after the community that defined it was gone. If he passed down only violence sharpened by grief, the Noxian attack would have changed the art even while failing to erase its name. The decision to teach became one of the invasion's quiet reversals. Noxus destroyed Wuju to prevent its power from opposing the Empire. Yi preserved it by refusing to let opposition to Noxus become its only purpose. For a time, anger threatened to decide what Wuju would become. Yi could pursue those responsible until nothing remained except retaliation, or he could preserve the teachings that the attack had nearly erased. His later decision to train Wukong did not undo the loss. It answered the purpose of the attack. Noxus had tried to end Wuju by destroying its community, while Yi ensured that the art would continue through another student. The war reached young people in harsher ways, as commanders searched for any advantage. Shida Kane was born in Noxus and conscripted as a child soldier, one among many children used by a commander who expected their presence to confuse or delay Ionian defenders. The tactic assumed that compassion could be turned into a weakness. It worked only until Kane encountered Zed and the Order of Shadow. Zed saw ability in the boy and gave him a place among the Order. Kane changed sides, but the event cannot be reduced to a simple rescue. The invasion had already taken his childhood and shaped him around combat. Under Zed, he received training, purpose, and the chance to become powerful. Yet he also became part of the armed movement created by Ionia's wartime fracture. Noxus lost one disposable soldier and helped create a future master of Ionian shadow magic. The encounter revealed how assumptions about mercy shaped tactics. Kane's commander expected Ionian fighters to hesitate before children, converting a moral boundary into an opportunity for attack. Zed answered by judging the child according to potential rather than origin, denying Noxus the sacrifice it had planned. That choice could appear to prove the best of Noxian merit inside an Ionian order. Kane received advancement because Zed recognized talent, not because of family or nationality. The difference lay in the purpose surrounding it. Noxus had treated his life as cheap before he demonstrated power, while Zed made power the condition through which he earned a future. Neither system returned the childhood the invasion removed. Training within the Order of Shadow deepened Kane's identity as a weapon and encouraged an ambition large enough to challenge every limit around him. His story shows rescue and exploitation existing uncomfortably close together during war. For Ionia, accepting a Noxian-born child also challenged the idea that nationality alone decided loyalty. The invader was an empire and army, not every person born within its borders. Kane's later devotion to Zed became stronger than the connection imposed by his birthplace, even though the methods he embraced remained dangerous to Ionia in other ways. Other young Ionians entered the war without choosing either side's methods. Irelia of Navori had wanted to study the dances of her province. Her family sent her to the Placidium, a sacred place of learning, where her movements attracted the attention of a respected teacher. Nothing in that early life suggested she would become the face of an organized resistance. The invasion made the decision for her. When Irelia returned home, the occupation had reached her community. Noxian forces had taken the lives of family members and destroyed the home to which she expected to return. She recovered pieces of the family's metal crest, and the dance she had learned became the means through which she moved those blades. An art preserved for beauty and tradition became a weapon, because every gentler purpose around it had been taken away. Barely 14, Irelia entered a conflict already filled with older leaders and experienced fighters. Her importance did not come from formal rank. It came from giving scattered defenders a moment around which they could gather. Noxus understood armies, chains of command, and the removal of established authorities. It was less prepared for a child whose grief and skill could turn public fear into collective resistance. Her age exposed the invasion's effect more clearly than another experienced warrior could have done. Irelia had not spent years preparing for command, building a faction, or asking others to treat her as exceptional. Noxian occupation compressed the distance between childhood and public responsibility until survival left no room for a gradual transition. The dance at the center of her ability also carried a distinctly Ionian answer to Noxian force. The Empire built strength through standard ranks, equipment, and orders that could be reproduced across a war host. Irelia drew strength from a local tradition, family memory, and movements that had never been designed for military use. Noxus encountered a weapon it could not separate from the culture producing it. People followed because the transformation resembled their own. Farmers, students, artisans, and spiritual practitioners had all been forced to use ordinary knowledge in extraordinary ways. Irelia's blades made that adaptation visible. She did not stand above the resistance as a professional conqueror. She reflected the people becoming defenders around her. Leadership still required more than inspiration. Separate groups needed to hold positions, trust warnings, and act together despite having no shared training. Irelia's success came partly from persuading people that their different abilities belonged inside one defense. Unity did not mean making them identical. That form of command answered the immediate Noxian advantage. An empire could study the structure of another army and identify the people whose removal would paralyze it. The Ionian resistance depended on relationships that changed from one battle to the next. Its weakness was inconsistency, but its strength was the absence of one system Noxus could completely dismantle. That confrontation came to define the Battle of the Placidium. Noxian forces under Jericho Swain advanced on one of Ionia's most important spiritual centers, expecting another decisive victory. Swain was already known as a strategist, and the campaign gave him a command worthy of that reputation. The defenders facing him did not resemble a conventional army, but Irelia brought them together long enough to make their differences an advantage rather than a weakness. The Placidium mattered before any soldier entered it. It represented learning, culture, and the spiritual heart of Navori, which made its capture valuable beyond the ground itself. If Noxus could dominate such a place, the victory would tell surrounding provinces that even their most respected centers could not protect them. If the defenders held it, they could turn that same symbolism against the Empire. Irelia's presence joined private loss to public resistance. She did not address the defenders as a distant authority, asking them to sacrifice for an idea. Noxian occupation had destroyed her family and home, placing her experience beside theirs. The blades moving around her also carried the remains of the family crest, which meant the weapon that inspired resistance had been made from something the invasion tried to erase. Swain brought the confidence of a commander whose career rested on seeing patterns before his opponent did. That talent could organize troops and anticipate conventional choices, but the defenders at the Placidium were being organized by a symbol he had helped create. Their willingness to gather around Irelia could not be separated from the occupation's treatment of her community. The battle did not suddenly transform every Ionian into a soldier. It provided proof that coordinated action could stop the Imperial advance. News of Swain's defeat traveled farther than any single band of fighters, giving separated movements a common reference point. Noxus had possessed the advantage of reputation when its war hosts seemed endless. Irelia gave the resistance a reputation of its own. At the Placidium, she defeated Swain and severed his arm. The physical loss mattered, though the greater defeat belonged to the plan behind the invasion. A place associated with spiritual learning became the site where Ionian resistance proved that Noxian expansion could be stopped. Irelia emerged as a leader not because she sought authority, but because people had watched her stand where established institutions had hesitated. The victory did not end the war. Noxus still held territory, possessed more soldiers, and could replace commanders. What changed was the expectation surrounding the campaign. Every occupied province now had evidence that resistance could succeed, while Noxian officers had to account for an enemy becoming more coordinated with every attempt to crush it. The Placidium turned an invasion into a struggle the Empire could no longer present as an easy addition to its borders. Success also created expectations Irelia could not control. Fighters who had followed her during the battle looked to her afterward, and communities repeated the story until the young dancer became inseparable from national resistance. A person can leave a battlefield. A symbol cannot decide where other people carry it. Some wanted that symbol to promise the restoration of peace. Others wanted it to justify a permanent military movement strong enough to punish Noxus. The difference would become sharper after withdrawal, but it already existed during the war. Defenders could agree that Swain must be stopped without agreeing on whether victory should return Ionia to its former condition or replace that condition with something harder. Noxus faced a related problem. Removing Swain after his defeat did not repair the assumptions that brought the army to the Placidium. Other commanders could continue the campaign, and Darkwill's government could spend more troops to avoid admitting that the invasion had stalled. A regime built around strength had difficulty acknowledging that persistence could become waste. Swain's defeat began another transformation. Left wounded and discarded after the failed campaign, he discovered that the Empire's failures reached beyond poor battlefield decisions. A demonic presence gave him access to hidden knowledge, and Swain learned to use that power instead of becoming its servant. He returned to Noxus with a clearer view of the forces surrounding Darkwill and the people benefiting from endless war. Before Ionia, Swain had belonged to a Noxian family with status, and had already learned that power inside the Empire rarely matched its public appearance. He valued planning, information, and the ability to act on truths other people preferred hidden. Darkwill's invasion offered him a command, but it also placed him inside a campaign distorted by the Emperor's judgment. At the Placidium, strategic confidence met a form of resistance it had failed to measure. Losing his arm to Irelia reduced a celebrated commander to someone the regime could abandon with the rest of a failed operation. Noxus praised strength, and defeat made even a useful strategist appear disposable. The demon connected with secrets gave Swain a way to turn that abandonment into knowledge. Rather than accept the role of victim or allow the entity to consume him, he mastered enough of its power to see what had been concealed. The experience made his return more dangerous, because he no longer depended only on military reports or political allies to understand the Empire. His coup against Darkwill transformed a battlefield failure into a change of government. The Trifarics distributed rule among principles associated with vision, might, and guile, rejecting the idea that one emperor should direct Noxus according to personal obsession. Swain placed himself at the center of the new order without simply placing a crown on his own head. Ending the Ionian occupation served both reform and strategy. It stopped the Empire from spending more strength on a campaign Darkwill had failed to complete, while allowing Swain to present withdrawal as correction rather than surrender. Soldiers could return, resources could move elsewhere, and responsibility for failure could remain attached to the ruler he had overthrown. For Ionia, the reason mattered less than the result. Noxian forces withdrew because Noxian politics had changed, not because the Empire accepted the moral independence of the First Lands. Swain's reform removed one reckless ruler and created a state more capable of choosing when expansion served its interests. The man defeated by Irelia became the leader most likely to understand why another invasion could fail. He had seen the resistance organize, experienced the limits of Noxian intelligence, and built his new authority on learning from hidden mistakes. The Placidium ended Swain's first career and created the conditions for his second. Eventually, Swain overthrew the Emperor and replaced the old arrangement with the Triferics, dividing Noxian rule among 3 principles rather than leaving the Empire under one ruler. His rise changed Noxus, but it did not make him an Ionian hero. He had commanded invaders at the Placidium, and the empire he built remained expansionist. The difference was that Swain understood how Darkwill's campaign had wasted Noxian strength, and he ended the occupation that had trapped soldiers in a war without a clean conclusion. That later withdrawal can make the conflict appear simpler than it felt to those living through it. Ionia did not move from peace to invasion, and then return to peace. By the time Noxian forces pulled back, the country contained resistance armies, shadow warriors, survivors of chemical attacks, divided monasteries, ruined communities, and leaders whose authority came from warfare. Removing most Imperial troops could stop one stage of the conflict, but it could not restore the society that had existed before the first landing. The war also continued through people whose stories unfolded away from its most famous battle. At Pallas, a temple guarded a dangerous weapon left from an older age. Varus, a Darkin, had been imprisoned within a bow there, and Ionian wardens maintained the protection around it. Among them was Valmar, whose life was bound closely to Kai, a warrior who fought beside him. The temple's isolation depended on a promise that the danger inside would remain more important than any passing conflict outside. Noxus destroyed that separation. Once the invasion reached Pallas, the wardens had to defend their people and the sealed weapon at the same time. A duty designed for patience became almost impossible under military pressure. Noxian forces attacked the temple, drawing its guardians into the wider invasion. When Kai suffered grave wounds, Valmar carried him toward the chamber containing the forbidden bow, choosing the possibility of saving him over the duty to keep the weapons sealed. The power within offered survival at a cost neither man fully understood. Varus emerged by joining their bodies with his own imprisoned essence, and the 2 human voices remained within him, struggling against the Darkin's purpose. Valmar's decision came from loyalty to one person rather than a plan for the war. The temple's rules demanded that the Darkin remain imprisoned for the protection of everyone, while the immediate crisis narrowed the world to Kai's survival. Noxus made those duties collide at the worst possible moment. Varus carried intentions older than the invasion and far larger than the defense of Pallas. Once free, he did not become a grateful weapon for Ionia or a prize Noxus could claim. Valmar and Kai continued resisting him from within, turning one body into another unresolved struggle produced by the campaign. The event also warned against measuring wartime choices only by their immediate result. Reaching the bow prevented one kind of loss and released another danger into rune terror. Refusing it might have preserved the seal at an unbearable personal cost. The invasion created the emergency, but it did not provide a good answer. For that reason, Pallas belongs in the history of the war, even though Varus did not decide its major battles. The temple shows what happened whenever occupation reached places built around secrets. Defenders who had maintained a duty for generations were forced to choose under pressure, and powers that had waited for ages entered the present through one chaotic moment. Noxus did not intend to release Varus as part of a carefully planned strategy. The invasion created the emergency that broke the seal. That difference captures the danger of the entire campaign. An empire searching Ionia for power-disturbed forces older than its commanders, while defenders, forced into desperate choices, reached for answers their traditions had forbidden. The war repeatedly produced consequences neither side had planned, and neither could easily reverse. Another sealed power waited at Phalor. Long before the invasion, Ionians had confined Syndra within a hidden dreaming state, because her uncontrolled magic threatened those around her and the balance of the land. Noxus captured the fortress during the occupation, and the war later divided the Ionians once responsible for guarding it. Some wanted Syndra destroyed, while others hoped her strength could be used against the invaders. And that conflict led to her awakening. The people connected to Phalor did not agree on what should happen when the prison became vulnerable. Some believed Syndra had to be stopped, while others hoped her strength could be directed against Noxus. Both positions treated her as the answer to a wartime need. Syndra rejected the role entirely. Her awakening exposed another Ionian division hidden beneath the invasion. The authorities who had confined her believed they were protecting balance, while Syndra experienced that protection as control over her life and power. Noxus did not create the original conflict. Its conquest broke the structure containing it and forced the disagreement back into the open. Syndra did not awaken as an ally of Ionia simply because Noxus had invaded. Her anger reached toward the Ionian authorities who had confined her, as well as the outsiders occupying the fortress. She tore the structure from its foundations and raised it into the sky, leaving both sides with another power beyond their control. Once again, Noxian expansion had opened a door without knowing what stood behind it. Her refusal to serve either side challenged a habit shared by people who otherwise opposed one another. Noxian occupiers searched Ionia for power the Empire could absorb, while desperate Ionians considered whether Syndra's strength could defend them. Both approaches began by asking what she could do for their cause, rather than what her imprisonment had done to her. Syndra answered through independence. The fortress ceased to function as an Ionian prison or Noxian possession once she lifted it away, and its movement turned military geography into something no commander could predict. A fixed stronghold became a declaration that neither nation would decide where she belonged. Her awakening cannot be counted as an Ionian victory merely because Noxian control failed. The same power threatened people who had once guarded the prison and those who hoped to recruit her. War had removed containment without creating trust, leaving another unresolved force above a divided country. Phalor later remained valuable despite that history, which reveals the pressure of strategy. Noxus still needed its western position, and Ionians still understood the danger of allowing the Empire to hold it. Both sides returned attention to a place that had already demonstrated how military urgency could awaken consequences beyond military control. These events made the invasion larger than a contest between two governments. Ionia had no single government to begin with, and many of the powers released by the conflict did not recognize the neat division between invader and defender. Spirits reacted to disturbance, old weapons found new bearers, monasteries split over doctrine, and individuals settled private losses inside a public war. The farther Noxus moved into the First Lands, the less the campaign resembled the conquest its planners understood. For ordinary Noxian soldiers, that confusion did not remove responsibility, but it complicated the reasons they remained. Some believed in the Empire, as Riven once had. Others followed commanders because military service offered food, status, or citizenship. Conscripts possessed fewer choices, and children such as Cain possessed almost none. A war host could include committed expansionists, frightened recruits, ambitious officers, and people who had never seen Ionia before their ship reached its coast. Noxian identity also allowed conquered peoples to become agents of later conquest. The Empire did not define belonging through one ancestry, which meant a recruit from a territory absorbed in one generation might fight to absorb another in the next. That system gave genuine opportunities to some, while ensuring that military expansion continually supplied the Empire with new strength. The result complicates any picture of a single Noxian people arriving with one motive. An officer might seek rank, a runesmith might serve because specialized work granted status, and a soldier might believe Imperial membership had improved life for their own family. Those motives could explain participation without making the occupation harmless. Ionians experienced the same army regardless of the private reasons inside it. Riven's early loyalty grew from this promise. Noxus judged her ability and gave her a path that poverty had denied, so she interpreted the Empire through the opportunity it provided. The betrayal of her warband cut deeply, because the campaign did not merely reveal that war was cruel. It revealed that the system claiming to reward strength would discard loyal soldiers whenever command found their loss convenient. Kain represented the opposite end of that system. He did not rise through a fair test of ability before being sent to Ionia. A commander used him and other children as pieces in a tactic, expecting their deaths to create an opening. Noxus could speak about merit, yet the invasion showed how little choice existed for people without enough power to demand it. Irith, a Noxian soldier from a people incorporated into the Empire, later offered another view. He belonged to the first generation of his tribe born as Noxians, and had been trained for Imperial service from childhood. When he travelled toward Ionia with a warband searching for Riven, he carried loyalty to the country that had given his people a new identity, along with uncertainty about the old wounds surrounding the campaign. His experience on Phalor and the journey beyond it showed that even Noxian soldiers inherited a war they did not begin. Riven's former companions remembered the abandoned warband directly. Younger fighters learned fragments through training, military stories, and the marks carried by veterans. The first invasion became part of Noxian identity as a failure that demanded explanation. Ionian resistance contained its own incompatible motives. Irelia fought to drive out occupiers and protect communities. Zed believed survival justified shadow techniques the Kinko had forbidden. Karma tried to join spiritual duty with active defense, while Shen continued guarding a balance that could not be reduced to national victory. Master Yi carried the survival of Wuju, and Li Xin carried the danger of a power that could save a monastery while damaging it. Their shared enemy did not erase those differences. It only postponed some of the arguments. During the occupation, every group could point toward Noxus as the immediate danger. As the Empire withdrew, the question changed from how Ionia should survive to what kind of country survival had created. That was the argument Noxus left behind. The Vastaya added another layer to that argument. Their lives and magic depended closely on the spiritual environment, which made disruption of the land especially dangerous to them. Human settlement had already produced tension over access to magic before the war, and Noxian occupation did not make those older disagreements disappear. Some Vastaya fought the invaders. Yet alliance against Noxus did not automatically resolve their disputes with human Ionians. A movement seeking to militarize the land's magic could appear necessary to human survivors and threatening to people whose existence relied upon that same flow. Preparing for another invasion might protect the country while repeating the habit of treating spiritual power as a resource to be controlled. This is one reason the word unity carried different meanings after the war. To the Navori Brotherhood, unity could mean a nation organized strongly enough to repel Noxus. To the Kinko, it could mean restoring balance between realms and communities. To groups distrustful of central power, it could sound like one faction using emergency authority to dominate everyone else. The first invasion proved that isolation was dangerous, but it did not prove that centralization was safe. Ionia had to choose between risks rather than recover a perfect solution from its past. No pair of stories shows the private damage of the war more clearly than Riven and Yasuo. While Noxian commanders used chemical weapons against the battlefield where Riven's unit had been abandoned, the attack shattered her faith in the Empire. She carried her runic blade into the Ionian countryside and eventually sought a way to destroy it. The sword could be broken into pieces, she hoped, and the oath attached to it might break as well. Elder Suma understood wind technique and agreed to help. When he attempted to break the blade, its magic released with fatal consequences. Riven did not set out to kill him, but she fled with the truth buried beneath shock and fear. The broken weapon remained, and the manner of Suma's death pointed toward a form of wind technique known to very few people. Yasuo should have been guarding the Elder. He had been an unusually gifted and difficult student, the only person of his generation able to master the legendary wind technique Soma taught him. When sounds of battle reached him, Yasuo abandoned his assigned post because he believed his abilities could help elsewhere. He found only the aftermath of a terrible attack and returned to discover that Soma had died while left unprotected. Suspicion settled on Yasuo for reasons that appeared convincing. He had deserted his duty, the Elder had been killed by a wind-related force, and Yasuo possessed the rare technique that could explain it. Rather than submit to judgment while the actual cause remained unknown, he escaped. Every effort to defend himself made him appear more guilty, and former allies began hunting him across a country already disordered by war. His original choice contained the confidence that had always made him difficult to guide. Yasuo heard battle and assumed his talent belonged where the fighting appeared greatest, even though his assigned duty protected someone the school considered more important. He intended to help Ionia, but intention could not guard Soma once he left. The battlefield he reached offered no heroic role. Whatever had happened there was already over, and the unnatural aftermath showed that one gifted swordsman could not have controlled it. Yasuo returned having accomplished nothing, and found that the duty he abandoned had become the center of another disaster. Submitting to judgment might have honored the rules of his school, yet the evidence made conviction likely and left the actual cause undiscovered. Escape preserved the possibility of truth while destroying the trust required for others to believe him. Every pursuer he fought added another real offense around the false one. Yorn approached as both brother and representative of the order Yasuo had rejected. Their encounter carried affection, obligation, resentment, and a public demand for justice. Neither man reached it from a position where walking away seemed compatible with who he believed himself to be. The duel settled nothing the war needed settled. It did not identify Soma's killer, repair the school, or protect another province. It turned institutional suspicion into family loss, proving how easily invasion could make private honor serve chaos. Yon, Yasuo's older half-brother, eventually found him. Yon carried the duty of bringing the accused man back, while Yasuo carried the need to continue searching for the truth. Their confrontation ended with Yone's death and left Yasuo with a second burden created by the first. The invasion had not ordered either brother into that fight. It had built the circumstances around them until honor, accusation, and fear made the encounter almost unavoidable. Years later, the truth emerged through Riven's broken sword and the memories surrounding Elder Soma's death. Riven admitted her part, though the event was shown to be an accident rather than a deliberate murder. Yasuo finally learned that he had not killed his master, but innocence could not return the years he had spent as a fugitive or undo the loss of his brother. Riven received a path based on service and rebuilding rather than a simple execution, binding her future to the country her army had helped damage. Their stories resist an easy division between innocent Ionian and guilty Noxian. Yasuo made a reckless choice when he left his post, but he did not commit the crime attached to his name. Riven joined the invasion willingly, yet the Empire betrayed her unit and the Elder's death was unintended. Each carried responsibility without carrying all of the blame, which is one reason the war remained so difficult to leave behind. The invasion also transformed people who were still children when the fighting began. Akali grew up within the Kinko, while the Order struggled to preserve its mission amid occupation and rebellion. She inherited a world in which Shen's restraint looked inadequate to many young Ionians, even though his duty extended beyond any one war. Her eventual departure from the Order followed the path the invasion had opened. Loyalty to Ionia separated from obedience to the institutions that once defined it. Kennen stayed with Shen and continued trying to hold the Kinko together. That choice lacked the visible satisfaction of driving soldiers from a village, but it protected a role the war had nearly erased. If everyone with power turned toward national revenge, no one would remain to watch the boundary between realms. The invasion made such work appear distant from immediate suffering, even as the damage to Ionia's spiritual balance made it more necessary. Zed's followers faced no such hesitation. The Order of Shadow treated Noxian occupation as proof that the older way had failed, and its members embraced weapons their teachers feared. Their campaign helped defend Ionia, yet it also made armed power part of the country's internal politics. Once a group has built itself around the belief that only strength can prevent another invasion, peace does not provide an obvious reason to disband. Among the resistance movements that grew after the war, the Navori Brotherhood carried the clearest demand for a stronger and more unified Ionia. Its supporters looked at the destruction of villages, temples, and families and concluded that old provincial independence had invited conquest. They wanted a country able to strike back, punish collaborators, and prepare for the Empire's return. To survivors who had watched hesitation cost lives, that argument carried real force. The Brotherhood's appeal grew from a problem no peaceful tradition could fully answer. If Noxus returned, Ionia would need someone to command the defense during the days before local groups found one another. The first invasion had shown what those lost days could cost. A permanent force promised speed, planning, and the ability to protect communities before they became symbols of another tragedy. Militarization promised other changes as well. Training could be standardized, routes prepared, supplies stored, and knowledge shared between provinces. None of those measures required hatred in themselves. The danger came from the authority needed to enforce them, and from the belief that every part of Ionian life should now serve preparation for war. Once fear of invasion becomes the reason for permanent power, leaders can use that fear against internal opponents. Someone who questions a military policy can be called disloyal, while a spiritual warning can be dismissed as the same hesitation that failed during the first landings. The Brotherhood's strongest argument and greatest danger came from the same source: Noxus genuinely might return. The Order of Shadow approached the future through trained power rather than broad national government. Zed believed fighters willing to use forbidden methods could meet threats before those threats reached ordinary communities. His order offered discipline and direct action to people who regarded the Kinko's neutrality as a historical failure. Shadow magic also separated the Order from the limits that once governed it. The power had been forbidden for a reason, and using it against Noxus did not guarantee that it would remain confined to foreign enemies. An institution created during occupation needed new purposes after occupation, which encouraged its leaders to identify dangers within Ionia as well as beyond it. Shen inherited the task of preserving the Kinko without allowing the Order to become another army. His position could look passive beside the movements calling for national defense. But the invasion had disturbed spirits, awakened old forces, and damaged the boundary his order watched. Every consequence surrounding Varus and Syndra supported the warning that military victory was not the only kind of survival Ionia required. Akali eventually decided that Shen's larger balance placed too many limits on the defense of actual people. She left formal obedience behind and pursued enemies more directly, another choice made possible by the invasion's legacy. Unlike Zed, she did not simply join the Order of Shadow, which showed that rejection of Kinku restraint did not produce one unified alternative. Karma faced pressure from every direction. Traditional followers wanted the wisdom of previous incarnations to guide the present, victims wanted action, and militant groups could use her approval as proof that their plans represented Ionia itself. Her office joined generations together, yet the invasion created problems no inherited memory could settle without change. Irelia's symbolic authority made her equally valuable to competing visions. A militant faction could point to the Placidium and argue that decisive force saved the country. A defender of provincial freedom could point out that Irelia united volunteers without building an empire of her own. Her story belonged to everyone, which meant no one could fully control what it was used to support. Irelia did not fit comfortably inside that future. Her victories made her a symbol around which militant groups could organize, though she had not fought to become a ruler or conqueror. People expected her to provide unity because she had done so at the Placidium. The expectation ignored the difference between gathering defenders during an emergency and deciding how an entire country should live afterward. That burden followed her into the uneasy peace. She could not simply return to dance as if the occupation had been an interruption. The blades made from her family crest remained part of her, and the names of people she lost remained tied to every victory others celebrated. Ionia needed the figure that resistance had created, while Irelia still carried the life that creation had displaced. Public memory simplifies people because symbols work best when they carry one clear meaning. Irelia became courage, Swain became the defeated invader, and the Placidium became the moment Ionia rose. The actual people remained more complicated. Irelia had been a child placed under an impossible weight, and Swain used defeat to become more dangerous than the commander she had beaten. The same simplification affected Riven. To many Ionians, she could only be a Noxian soldier connected to the invasion. To Noxian authorities, she could only be a deserter who abandoned her oath. Neither label contained the warband sacrificed by its own command, the accidental death of Soma, or the work she later performed among the people who sheltered her. Yasuo became the accused killer before he became the man proven innocent. Yi became the last master of Wuju after once being one student among a living community. Lee Sin became the blind defender without allowing the title to explain the pride, exile, friendship, and restraint that shaped his return. These stories mattered because the post-war struggle was partly a struggle over memory. Factions selected the events that supported the future they wanted. Militants remembered the cost of hesitation. Traditionalists remembered the cost of releasing power without balance. Survivors remembered both, often within the same life. For Swain, the Ionian defeat produced a different lesson. The old Noxian regime had mistaken size for strength, throwing lives and resources into campaigns shaped by hidden interests and personal obsession. His Tripharics promised a more stable empire based on vision, might, and guile. Noxus withdrew from much of Ionia under his rule, but the strategic interest in the First Lands did not disappear. Swain knew from experience that Ionia could not be defeated by repeating the same plan. Its lack of central government created weakness during the first landings, then made the resistance difficult to destroy because no single capital could surrender for everyone. Its spiritual traditions discouraged rapid mobilization, Yet the powers contained within those traditions could overwhelm conventional forces once their guardians chose to act. Any renewed campaign would have to account for an Ionia already changed by the first. Noxus had changed as well. The empire that might return would not belong to Darkwill, and it would not arrive believing that the First Lands were defenseless. It had witnessed Irelia's resistance, the power of karma, the techniques of Wuju, and the danger of awakening forces such as Syndra. It had also left agents, occupied positions, and years of knowledge behind. Withdrawal ended the broad occupation, not Noxian attention. The island fortress of Phalor remained one of the clearest signs that the conflict had not truly closed. Its position offered Noxus a foothold and placed Imperial forces close to the country they once tried to conquer. Later stories show Noxian soldiers operating in and around Ionia, while both sides recognize the possibility of a larger return. The peace is real enough for communities to rebuild, but never secure enough for them to forget why they need defenders. Phalor held several layers of the war at once. It was an Ionian fortress captured during invasion, the site connected to Syndra's imprisonment and awakening, and a staging point Noxian forces could use for later operations. Whoever controlled it possessed a military advantage, but the broken land and unstable history surrounding it made control uncertain. Noxian soldiers returning there encountered a place marked by the first campaign. Veterans carried scars and memories, newer recruits inherited stories, and the island itself refused to become an ordinary Imperial base. The environment reminded them that occupation did not transform Ionia into predictable territory. The mission involving Riven brought former members of her warband back into contact with the choice that separated them. Some had remained tied to Noxus, while Riven had tried to disappear into Ionian life. Their reunion was not simply the capture of one deserter. It reopened the question of who betrayed whom when Command abandoned the unit beneath a chemical attack. Arel, Tenef, Marit, and the others, connected to the old warband, carried different loyalties and losses. No single account of Riven could satisfy all of them, because each had survived the same event through a different path. The Empire wanted an answer that military law could understand. The veterans wanted answers about one another. Irith entered that history without possessing all of it. His presence allowed the inherited idea of Noxus to meet the memories of people who had seen the campaign's worst contradictions. He had been taught that service bound the Empire together. The search for Riven showed how service could also bind people to decisions made before they were old enough to question them. When the group reached the Ionian community sheltering Riven, the old division between invader and resident no longer appeared clean. Riven had fought for Noxus and worked beside Ionians. Noxian soldiers came to retrieve her, yet some of those soldiers once trusted her with their lives. The village could treat her as a person rebuilding, or as an enemy who had never faced enough punishment. Riven's capture carried the conflict back across the sea. The first invasion had sent her to Ionia as a decorated believer in the Empire, while its aftermath returned her to Noxus as a prisoner. Her direction reversed, but the war remained the force moving her. Riven's later fate demonstrates that continuing reach. She had tried to live among an Ionian farming community and accept responsibility through work. But Noxus did not simply forget a decorated soldier who deserted during a failed campaign. She was eventually taken back toward the Empire, drawing former members of her warband and new Noxian soldiers into another chain of loyalty, resentment, and unfinished duty. Those soldiers carried their own memories of Ionia. Some wanted Riven punished, some wanted answers, and some still believed in the commander they had followed. The Empire treated desertion as a crime, while Riven understood her refusal to return as the last honest response available to her. Neither view erased the fact that the war host had been sacrificed by its own side. Her former companions also complicated the claim that Noxus had simply learned from Darkwill and moved forward. Political reform could change the ruler without repairing every life used by the former regime. Swain recalled forces and reorganized government, but veterans still carried wounds created by orders given before his coup. A stronger Noxus rested partly on people who had already paid for its mistakes. Ionia faced the same limit. Driving out occupiers did not repair every place, restore every school, or reconcile every order. Political freedom created the opportunity to rebuild, not the finished result. The war's end removed an immediate cause of suffering, while exposing conflicts that resistance had held together. The renewed movement of Noxian forces made another invasion possible, without giving the law a completed second campaign. That distinction matters. Visions and cinematic suggestions can show recognizable champions facing one another, but they do not supply a full canonical history of a war that has already happened. The confirmed present is an armed and unstable peace. With Noxus retaining both the interest and the ability to return, and Ionia divided over how far preparation should reshape it. That uncertainty changes the meaning of every post-war decision. A weapons store can be preparation for defense or the beginning of permanent militarization. A spiritual order refusing political command can be protecting balance or repeating an old failure. Noxian reconnaissance can be a limited operation, or the first movement of a campaign not yet visible. People living near the coast cannot wait for a future historian to decide which interpretation was correct. They make choices with the memory of the first invasion and incomplete knowledge of the next. That is how an uneasy peace continues the logic of war without constant battles. For Noxus, uncertainty offers strategic value. The possibility of invasion forces Ionia to spend attention and resources even before a full fleet sails. Different factions can accuse one another of preparing too little or seeking too much power. The Empire benefits whenever fear of Noxus deepens Ionian division. For Ionia, uncertainty can also encourage cooperation. Shared watch over the coast, communication between provinces, and protection of vulnerable sites do not require every community to surrender its identity. The first invasion taught that coordination could grow without becoming one imperial structure, although maintaining that balance is harder than declaring it. To understand why the first invasion failed, it helps to separate military withdrawal from total defeat. Noxus succeeded in landing armies, occupying territory, destroying important communities, and changing Ionian politics. It failed to turn those gains into lasting control over the first lands. The longer the campaign continued, the more defenders learned to cooperate, and the more expensive occupation became. Ionia's geography worked against centralized conquest. Provinces spread across an archipelago could lose one settlement without giving every other settlement to the invader. Local knowledge allowed resistance to survive away from major roads and coastal positions. The living land introduced dangers no campaign map could fully represent, and spiritual power gave individuals influence far beyond what their numbers suggested. Noxian strategy also created its own enemies. The destruction of Irelia's family did not remove a threat, it created the leader of resistance at the Placidium. Using children as expendable troops did not secure a victory, it delivered Cain to Zed. Chemical attacks eliminated defenders in the short term, then turned Riven against the Empire and left Master Yi as the keeper of a nearly destroyed art. Interference at ancient sites released Varus and Syndra, neither of whom could be ordered into a Noxian formation. Darkwill's government treated people and knowledge as resources to be spent. That approach could produce rapid expansion when enemies broke under the first assault. Ionia absorbed the losses and changed. Every escalation proved to another group that neutrality would not protect it, slowly solving the coordination problem that had made the country vulnerable. The resistance did not win, because Ionia suddenly formed one perfect army. It won enough battles, denied enough control, and raised the cost of occupation until a changing government in Noxus chose withdrawal. This was a political and strategic ending rather than one final clash in which every Noxian soldier left the field. That quieter conclusion explains why both sides could claim lessons from the war without resolving the conditions that caused it. Noxus could argue that Darkwill's leadership, waste, and hidden manipulation ruined a campaign the Empire might conduct more intelligently in the future. Ionians could argue that unity saved the country, though they disagreed over whether unity required a central state. A permanent army, militant orders, or simply cooperation during danger. Each lesson pointed toward another conflict. The deepest Noxian mistake was assuming that Ionia's peace meant passivity. Ionian restraint had been supported by traditions capable of terrible force, and the invasion removed the moral certainty that kept those traditions apart from war. Karma used the power of her ancient soul against a warship. Lee Sin released the dragon to defend a monastery. Zed opened forbidden paths and trained others to follow them. Irelia turned dance into a language of resistance. Yet calling that transformation a victory hides what it cost. Ionia survived as a free land, but the society that emerged could no longer trust its previous innocence. Armed groups gained authority, spiritual orders lost members, and survivors carried disagreements that Noxian occupation had made personal. A country once held together by balance now had to decide whether balance could include preparation for war. For some, the answer was a stronger defense without abandoning Ionian identity. For others, safety required the willingness to strike Noxus before its ships returned. The Kinko continued to warn that mortal vengeance could unbalance forces larger than either nation. The Order of Shadow treated such caution as an invitation to another invasion. Neither position could dismiss the evidence held by the other. Shen could point to spirits and ancient powers disturbed by reckless action. Zed could point to villages destroyed, while disciplined guardians waited. Karma's experience contained both warnings at once, because her interventions saved lives while separating her from part of the tradition she embodied. Irelia carried the same contradiction in a more human form, preserving her homeland through a war that took away the ordinary life she hoped to preserve. Master Yi's answer was transmission. He could not rebuild Wuju by pursuing every Noxian connected to the attack, but he could deny the Empire the final result it wanted. Teaching the discipline to Wukong moved the art into a future beyond one village and one survivor. It was not forgiveness, and it was not forgetting. It was a form of resistance that did not require the war to continue forever. Riven's answer was service. She could not claim that abandoning Noxus erased her role in the invasion, yet returning to imperial obedience would repeat the betrayal that broke her faith. Living among Ionians and working to repair what had been damaged offered a slower judgment. Her story asks whether a person shaped by an invading army can become part of the land that army harmed without pretending the past never happened. Yasuo's answer remained movement. Learning the truth about Soma removed the false accusation, but did not restore his place, his brother, or the years spent fleeing. The war had turned one impulsive decision into a life organized around guilt. Freedom from the charge was only the beginning of deciding what to do with that life. Swain's answer was control. He returned from failure determined never again to remain blind to the powers directing Noxus. His demon gave him access to secrets, and the Trifarics reduced the chance that another Darkwill could command the Empire alone. The solution strengthened Noxus, rather than making it peaceful, leaving Ionia to wonder whether the next invasion would be led by the man who understood the first one's failures better than anyone. Irelia's answer was duty without comfort. She remained a defender because Noxus might return, and because movements within Ionia could use her absence to claim her legacy for themselves. The child who had united fighters at the Placidium became an adult, expected to carry the meaning of that battle wherever she went. Victory made her indispensable and denied her the freedom to stop being a symbol. That is why the invasion broke Ionia, even though it did not conquer it. Noxus failed to absorb the first lands into its empire, but it destroyed the assumption that Ionia could remain safe without deciding what it was. The provinces could no longer rely on distance, spiritual balance, or the absence of foreign enemies. Every tradition had been forced to define the point at which restraint became surrender. The answer differed from one person to another. Zed crossed the line early and built an order around the choice. Shen held to an older duty despite the anger it inspired. Karma changed the meaning of her office. Li Xin accepted the cost of power. Yi preserved a nearly lost tradition. Riven rejected the empire that had formed her, while Swain rebuilt that empire around lessons learned from defeat. None of these stories sits outside the main war. Together, they are the war. The Noxian invasion did not possess one uninterrupted front or one final battle because Ionia did not possess one army. It moved through temples, villages, schools, families, ports, fortresses, and individual vows, creating a different conflict wherever it arrived. At the Placidium, the war produced national resistance. At Wuju, it nearly erased a martial tradition. At the Kinko Temple, it turned disagreement into schism. Around Riven's unit, it revealed how readily Darkwill's command would sacrifice its own soldiers. At Pallas and Phalor, it disturbed imprisoned powers whose consequences extended far beyond the campaign. The invasion's completeness lies in those connections. Irelia's rise cannot be separated from Swain's fall, and Swain's fall cannot be separated from the Noxian revolution that ended Darkwill's reign. Riven's desertion cannot be separated from Singed's weapons, and her broken blade cannot be separated from Yasuo's accusation. Yi's survival cannot be separated from the destruction of Wuju, while Kane's loyalty to Zed began with a Noxian commander treating children as tools. Even the withdrawal links back to the invasion's first weakness. Noxus crossed the sea with the organization to begin a war, while Ionia needed suffering to organize a defense. Once that defense existed, the Empire faced a country filled with fighters who had learned its methods and leaders whose legitimacy came from opposing it. Swain could end a wasteful occupation, but he could not make Ionia forget how close conquest had come. The uneasy peace left both nations stronger in some ways and less stable in others. Noxus replaced an emperor whose ambitions had drained the empire, creating a government better able to direct its power. Ionia gained experienced defenders and a clearer sense of shared identity. Yet the groups carrying that identity disagreed about almost everything beyond the need to survive. Another Noxian landing would not meet the country Darkwill first attacked. It would meet Irelia's veterans, militant Navori, shadow warriors, spiritual defenders, and communities that had spent years remembering occupation. That strength could stop an invasion. It could also pull Ionia into internal conflict over who commands it, which weapons are acceptable, and whether defense ends at the coast. Another Ionian campaign would not meet Darkwill's Noxus either. Swain's empire studies weakness, distributes authority through the Triforix, and understands the value of information. The Grand General knows the Placidium not as a story, but as the place where his own certainty failed. If he directs Noxian power toward Ionia again, he will do so with the memory of losing an arm and an army's momentum to a resistance he underestimated. For now, the conflict remains unfinished without becoming an active war across every province. Noxian positions and agents keep the threat close. Ionian factions prepare according to their own beliefs. Survivors rebuild, train students, guard temples, and carry broken weapons into futures the first invasion shaped. The war began because Noxus saw a divided land rich in power and assumed division meant weakness. It ended because each act of conquest gave another part of Ionia a reason to fight, until the Empire faced not one government it could overthrow, but a country learning how to resist in many different ways. Noxus withdrew before it could own the first lands. Yet ownership was never the only measure of damage. Ionia kept its freedom and lost the certainty that had defined it. Its people could no longer believe that harmony would survive without protection, and they could not agree on how much of their old identity protection should consume. That argument lives inside the Kinko and the Order of Shadow, inside Karma's divided inheritance, inside Irelia's unwanted leadership, and inside every community deciding whether rebuilding is enough. Noxus also carried the war home. Riven became proof that imperial ideals could collapse when command abandoned its own soldiers. Swain turned defeat into revolution and built a more disciplined state from the wreckage of Darkwill's rule. The Empire ended one occupation while preserving the ambition that had made invasion possible. No treaty erased these consequences, and no single victory settled them. The Placidium stopped Swain's advance, but the war continued. The later withdrawal removed most of the occupiers, but the divisions remained. Every major figure shaped by the conflict found a different way to live with what it had demanded, and none could return to the person who existed before it. That is the complete meaning of the Noxian invasion. It was a failed conquest, an Ionian victory, a Noxian political disaster, and the beginning of a more dangerous age for both nations. The Empire did not take Ionia, but it forced the First Lands to arm themselves, and in doing so it broke the old peace more completely than occupation ever could.